Welcome back on the AM show. We get into our big stories, and that first one having to do with the Ghana Journalists Association, what they've been saying in respect of that Oyerepa FM situation. But broadly, the interactions between the chieftaincy institution and the state when it comes to, of course, the fourth arm of government, so to speak, the fourth estate. Where do we go from here on the back of these latest developments? Well, joining us for that conversation, we have Professor Bafo Ajimandua, CEO of the Akakpo Foundation. We also have Professor Odike Akakpo, Dean School of Law and Information and Communication Studies at University of Ghana, and Osei Safo Kantanka, monarchical historian. Lady, gentlemen, a very good morning to you. Thank you for joining the conversation.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure.
Good morning.
Can I just correct? I'm no longer the Dean of the School of Information and Communication Studies.
Thank you so much, Prof. Akakpo, for that correction. Greatly appreciated. Can I hear from Mr. Safo Kantanka?
Yes, good morning.
Great. Good to hear you. Now, we all know the premise for the conversation, so I'll start with you. When it comes to chieftaincy, traditional institutions and what they stand for, I'd like you to give us a bit of a history, because as the picture has been painted, of course, we all the way from the Nkrumah era, pre-Nkrumah era and post the Nkrumah era, we have designated clearly what our chieftaincy institutions should represent. They have their authority, but it has an end, and then the state's power is overarching. But are we missing something when it comes to what chieftaincy can and cannot do in this specific respect?
Yeah, yes, until the day of independence, and even before...
Mr. Safo Kantanka, my sincere apologies. I can barely hear you. Could you speak up for me, sir?
Hello?
Yes.
Until the day of independence, or even before independence, the chiefs all over Africa wielded power, and that was the form of governance. We lived in tribes and in states, and each state or tribe had his own chief. Without them, there couldn't have been any form of governance. So our system of governance was embedded in the chieftaincy system. So our rulers were all chiefs. What happened was that with the coming in of the Europeans and the partitioning of Africa,
right,
they were put together, states. Indigenous states were all put together and given a name and made countries. So the laws, culture, and traditions, which were our laws, were, in a way, changed or were forced to change to follow the European way of life. European laws, European constitution was all that we followed. But we, in this part of Africa, Ghana, were lucky to have our land still vested in the indigenous leaders. They were responsible. The land did not belong to the leaders. The land belonged to the people. But the chiefs held these lands in trust for the people. It has remained till this day. Before then, they had numerous powers even to the point of a person death penalty. But when they came under the European laws, all these powers were taken from them and given to the heads of state or presidents and prime ministers of the land. So we are now governed by a constitution, in which case the chiefs and their subjects, and all that they were doing had to go strictly according to the constitution of the country. Some of the laws, some of the powers were still given back to them, or they still control some powers, like the lands. The lands are still in the hands of the people, and the people are led by their leaders, who are the chiefs. What is at stake today is that although the land belongs to you, but all the minerals in the land belongs to the government. Even the lands that they say belong to the people still belong to the government of Ghana, except that the chiefs and the people are holding it in trust for government. At this point in time, the powers of the chiefs have been so reduced to a degree that people take them for granted, or people don't see them as even important anymore. This is where we are treading on a very dangerous path. I think a time has come for us to do things side by side. The chiefs and the people and the government will have to put their heads together and do things in unison. Otherwise, there would always be conflict. We also lack education of the limits of the chief's powers, and governments actually have no limits, but they have given some portions of governance to the chiefs. But how many people know that this aspect of the law, or this aspect of governance, is where the chiefs are responsible? Lack of education, so there is almost always conflict. So this is the gist of chieftaincy. Institution has not been completely eroded. Now, if we were to erode the chieftaincy institution, that is culture, history, culture, and tradition, and the language, these come together to make our culture. This is all that we have to show to the rest of the world.
Right.
If there is no chieftaincy today, I doubt if we will have anything to show to the rest of the world as our culture.
Point made in that respect. I just want a very quick take on this. Are you suggesting then that the chieftaincy institution is being denigrated? I'll take you back to the Nkrumah era, where some felt that post-independence, the wings of the chieftaindom, if you like, had been clipped to the extent that they were becoming non-relevant. Today, we see the crucial role they play. And the likes of Professor Jampo will point to the fact that even in areas where the tentacles of the law cannot reach, it is the chiefs who stand in and resolve disputes. So would you say the chieftaincy institution has been denigrated? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. We have on record that President Nkrumah once made a statement that chiefs, he would make chiefs run away and leave their sandals behind. And we saw in his days where chiefs were thrown to jail, chiefs were chased out of the country to go to exile and all that.
But to be fair, pardon the interjection, to be fair, it was also because of the activities some chiefs were dabbling in, and if I may extend it, some chiefs from certain parts of the country who were seemingly not working in the interest of the state or working against the leader of the country then. Is that not the correct picture?
That is so, but they were not put before the law. They were only chased out. They were only unilaterally thrown to jail. So these are what we are talking about. That was an attack on the chieftaincy institution. If somebody has done wrong and then you are dealing with that person, or a chief has done wrong and you are dealing with a chief as required by a law, nobody would raise a finger about it.
Okay. Point made. Let me come to Professor Gajekpo. This borders on the Fourth Estate, and we all know that the Fourth Estate is expected to be that bastion of democracy, that cement that holds our democracy together, so that the arms of government, and indeed when it comes down to chieftaincy and the powers in there, they don't run amok. But in this instance, what is your initial reading of the Oyerepa situation? Is it an assault on the Fourth Estate, and are our traditional authorities overstretching their powers?
I think that we have to understand that for a long time, from when we were colonized to when we got independence, and I've heard reference to Nkrumah and all of that, our societies have changed. See, we've moved from traditional societies to modernity. And therefore, there are tensions that quite naturally have existed because of that. The historian told us about how the institution has evolved, and their powers, the powers of the chief, have shrunk, as it should in a modern democracy, because we've had referendums that said that we wanted to be modern democracy. Now we are also Africans, we have chieftaincy institutions. How then do those chieftaincy institutions and the powers that chiefs have, how do they coexist with modern institutions and modern concepts of what democracy means? And that's where the media comes in. And it's not just the media, but freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, you know. And those three things increasingly, not increasingly, but sometimes clash with perceived powers of chieftaincy. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that one of the pillars of democracy is freedom of speech and freedom of expression. The media is only an aspect of that freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Our democratic rights as citizens says that we can express ourselves so long as we don't libel people, so long as we don't slander people. We can criticize even authority. The chieftaincy institution is an authority, but so are our governments. So we can criticize our politicians, we can hold them accountable without fear of being sanctioned for doing that, without fear of intimidation. However, because I think that, in my opinion, a lot of the chiefs have not lived up to the democratic ideal. Their conception of democracy has been limited in the sense that they're enjoying the dividends of democracy, of course, but then when it comes to certain aspects of democracy that is tough, like criticizing a chief who you think is gone out of bounds, or the institution, then or doing something within a jurisdiction that they don't like, then they overstep their powers. So closing down a radio station, or even telling a radio station, you cannot say this about me, when what they're saying is not illegal, becomes a problem in the democratic society. You know, banishing people. We are in a constitutional democracy. We've had chiefs banish people from their jurisdiction. Meanwhile, our constitution says there should be freedom of movement. Right. And we've sat by and listened to chiefs issue bans on citizens because their behaviors are seen as unacceptable. We've seen recently the Ada Traditional Council pronounced that a radio station in the community could not cover a festival. So they really have overstepped their bounds and their powers in that respect. And I heard the first speaker talk about education. I think the chieftaincy institution and the chiefs need education as well. They have to be comfortable with the limitations of their powers. We cannot go back to the past. And by the way, even in the European society that introduced us to the democratic ideals, they too had monarchy. And increasingly, the powers of those monarchs were shrunk so that it becomes compatible with what the citizens now say they want as a system of governance, which is a constitutional democracy. They have to stick into the constitutional democracy.
Right. Interesting points you make, and rather interesting that you say the chiefs have, over time, overstepped their bounds. Two quick issues I want you to look at together. Odike himself, of the UPP, did he overstep his bounds? I don't know whether you've listened to what he said. I don't know what you think about what he said, if you did. Did he overstep his bounds? And then there are those like Professor Jampo who say, look, there are some who have suggested that the chieftaincy institution, on the back of their dabbling in politics, there's multiple sale of land, they're dabbling in Galamsey, so to speak, makes the institution anachronistic, and so we should let it go in the 21st century.
Okay.
So Odike
now,
and then the chieftaincy institution.
I have listened to the tape, but I'm not that competent in trees, so I may have missed a lot of the nuances of what was being said in that tape, what was being said in the tape. But I would like to say that it doesn't really matter, in a certain sense, what was said. It matters that if what was said offends whoever, whether it's a chief, as the chieftaincy institution, an individual, a politician, in fact, indeed, even the president, there are processes where you can complain. And the processes do not include issuing fatwas on people. It's very important for us to understand that, because we're in a constitutional democracy, and the chiefs do not have the power, no matter what is said, to decide that they're closing down a radio station or to decide that they are banishing people. There are processes to seek redress within our constitutional framework, and it's important that that be done. Now, the chiefs engaging in Galamsey or doing all manner of things, I mean, they're Ghanaian citizens, and we do know that that's part of the problem. People will say, how is it possible that you have such powers over a particular area and you can't stop Galamsey? I'm not going to go into that. However, that's why it's important that citizens have the ability, without intimidation, to hold chiefs accountable, to hold power accountable, so that they can criticize the chief. They can draw attention if indeed a chief is doing something that is harmful to the community, to the society. So by issuing fatwas, by threatening people who speak out, even if they may have exaggerated, it's very dangerous, because all of a sudden citizens are going to be afraid of pointing out when their chiefs go wrong. And where will we be as a society if people just keep quiet and don't hold those who have power accountable?
Right. Interesting points you make. Let me bring in Professor Bafo Agyemang-Duah. So, as I seek your initial reflections on this matter, the curious bit is the chiefs on the one hand are saying we don't have the powers to deal with the menace of Galamsey, and so leave us out of it. But on the other end of the spectrum, they seem to be saying we have the power to even shut down radio stations or media entities. So we don't have the power to fight Galamsey, but we have the power to tell you to shut down. Some find that to be a bit of a curiosity. How curious is this in the sense of governance, political leadership, traditional leadership?
Thank you, and hello to my very good friend and colleague, Professor Gajipo and Safo Kantanka. This current issue for me is a classic illustration of what I call the duality of the African. I think Ali Mazuri some years ago wrote a very interesting piece on this. Africans would live in a dual, at times triple worlds, especially if you bring in Christianity. Here we are as Africans with our own culture, tradition, and all. And when the idea of a modern state was introduced through the Europeans, we were unable to critically examine our existence and find a way to merge or to accommodate that which makes us Africans or Ghanaians. It is true that we are in a modern world. It is true that we have a democratic system. It is equally true that we still live as primordial beings. Ghanaians are more closely attached to their traditional traditions and their customs and their history, more than they are attached to the modern state. And a perfect example is to look at how public events are organized in this country. When politicians are having rallies, they go to buy or hire or rent crowds. When chiefs all over this country are having their festivals, they attract crowds, they don't buy them. And that tells you something. Again, if your chief summons you anywhere in this country, north, east, west, south, central, your response perhaps will be different from how you respond to an MC or minister even summoning you. I'm saying this to say that even though we have been highly educated, at times we are even overeducated, we still have those primordial ties to our being. And that is the crux of the matter. Look, in our history, all attempts from the colonial period to present have been made to dismantle the institution. But it seems to me that the chieftaincy institution has been the most resilient in our country even today. Today we are bemoaning the weakness of the judiciary, the executive, the parliament, and all. And the chiefs whose powers have been reduced drastically through the decades, they still survive and they are strong. These are basic facts we should recognize. And this brings me to the point here that when we are founding a new organization, we have what we call the foundational issues. It seems to me that when the state of Ghana was being founded, little recognition, if any at all, was given to an institution that has sustained Ghanaians for centuries. Somebody may use the term, it's now a relic of history. And I remember very well as a student, I used to say the same. But being here for so long, I now realize the power of this institution. So the point I'm making is simple. We live in two worlds. Africans, Ghanaians in particular, and in this particular case. But what we have to recognize that democracy gives us certain liberties that are universal, and that must be respected by all. And as Professor Gajepo rightly said, the media is the fourth estate in our constitution, and nothing should be done to cripple that estate because is the most powerful means for people to express themselves. At the same time, it's also important to note that if you are properly brought up in our society, you have to know how you speak. In our democracy, people stand anywhere and insult a president. Akufo-Addo, Kufuor, Rawlings, Atamils, Mahama. We insult them. And because we have a freedom of expression. But our culture and tradition also teach us that there's a better way of talking to our elders. Whether people who are highly educated today think that that is no longer necessary, then that's a different story. Because our existence as Ghanaians is rooted. If you are from the north, from the east, from the west, from the central part, you are rooted in something, what I call the primordial existence. So, despite all the intellectual sophistry that we can all engage in about democracy, modernity, and all that, the bottom line is that if you are summoned today by your chief, your response will be dramatically different from when you are summoned by your MCE or DC or your minister. So the point I'm making is simple. We need to find a way to accommodate these institutions. Look, we know of the weaknesses of these institutions, and also some people made the mistake to assume that our chiefs are illiterate. But I'm telling you today, there are many of these chiefs who are more educated than myself and many people who think we are PhDs and we are professors. They are highly educated people. And for them, they've successfully merged their Western education that all of us have gotten with their traditions and culture. They are richer than people like us. So I think this case, as I said from the beginning, illustrates very clearly the duality of our existence, and the challenge is how we find accommodation for the two worlds that we live in. This is my initial comment.
Interesting, very interesting, thoughts you have shared there. The primordial aspect, of course, the democratic aspect, and you threw in religion as well. We might want to stay away from that for now. But Mr. Tafu-Kantanka, with all these assertions that I made, there are two things that I want to run by you. And it still has to do with our governance structures, because it is clear per the Constitution what role the chiefs should play and what role governance institutions should play and what role the media should play. But here we are. I watched the clip, for example, before the show, citing Otumfuo Seitu II in one of his utterances in the past, stating how if he makes a declaration, a proclamation, no court within our jurisdiction can overturn it. Is that right? I mean, knowing what we do from the 1992 Constitution. And secondly, as some scholars have said as well, by complying, I mean, Oyerepa FM, by pandering to what Nananum had said, in a way, they lost that merit, that credibility. Would you say that what they did was right, shutting down, or could they have resisted in the name of the law, as some people suggest? So starting with Otumfuo and his proclamation and this one.
As much as the chiefs did not take the laws into their hands to go and shut down Oyerepa FM. They summoned Oyerepa FM to come and explain why they should allow somebody to use their medium to as it were, insult the chiefs.
But they did tell them. They did not forcefully go there to shut it down, but they told them not to operate until there is some conclusion to the matter. They told them that.
No, what my understanding is they told them that to be able to convince them, the chiefs, that they have regretted for what they did. Because they came there, accepted that they have made a mistake, and were pleading for forgiveness. So they told them that the manner in which you came was not the normal process. So they directed them to go by the normal process. And over and above that, advised them to close down their, to shut down their station, to convince them that indeed, if you have been able to shut down your station for a few days, and it is well expressed in the statement the chiefs made, for a few days, until we have finished deliberating upon the issue. They did not say they have closed it down. the power of closing it down. The chiefs are very much aware that they don't have the power to close down any media station. But they advise them. Maybe the language used in advising them was misconstrued to mean a force. The media station could have taken the option of not going to shut it down. So if they had that option and they had chosen the other option, why would people say the Menchia has shut down a station?
But technically, Mr. Safo Kantanka, if you look at the reaction, if you look at the assault on Odike's office, party office, the firing of gunshots, the fact that he had to hide, he had to leave the Ashanti region for fear of his life and what could happen to his supporters and his family. He spoke to us and said he was in a hideout. So yeah, on the back of that, if I may, on the back of that, would you not say that this was merely to avoid any clashes or victimization?
Why would people say that Odike's office was attacked by command from Menchia? Why would people say that?
No, we've not categorically said that, but we are saying that on the back of this.
I strongly believe that Odike staged a drama. So he's the first suspect.
Please clarify. Are you saying he staged the attack?
Sure. I'm confident until it has been proven that he did not stage a drama. It is a drama.
Mr. Kantanka, Safo Kantanka, I want to understand this clearly. You see the footage there of his party office vandalized, bullets going through cars. In fact, one of his men was hit by a stray bullet with these, young thugs attacking the premises, chanting, looking for him. And you say you think it was staged.
Yes, I think so. I think it was staged. And Odike could easily do that.
But based on what would you make this assertion?
It should be the first suspect. When somebody reports a case, you do not take it just because he has reported. He himself is a suspect. You're welcome, madam.
Hello, Mr. Safo Kantanka. I'm listening. I'm listening to you, sir. Hello? I think we unfortunately lost Mr. Safo Kantanka there. But very interesting point he was making, suggesting that Odike of the UPP, he believes, he is certain that Odike staged the attack to create some sort of scenario. When we get Mr. Safo Kantanka back, we'll take a look at that particular development and find out why he thinks in that line. But let me bring in Professor Gajekpo. Your reflections on these, because again, I'll go back to what the Asantehene has said. And I was about to pose to Mr. Safo Kantanka. We have a democracy, and this is not a monarchy, so to speak, a la, the UK or something of the sort. They have the Queen, but we know what roles she plays. In our democracy, can we have a king, whether it is the Ashanti king or, like some refer to, the Agbogbomefia of Asogli state as a king? Where do their powers end per what you see? And is it right, the decision that was taken by Asanteman?
Well, I think that what I've heard Mr. Kantaka say really disturbs me. Because I think that we ought to be concerned, if we live in a democracy, that a citizen has said he's been attacked, and it should be investigated. However, what I would have liked to have asked him is that, what did he think, especially in light of Professor Balfour's submission on the primordial state and the fact that people defer more to their chief than even their MP. If the chief told that radio station that they didn't think they should go on air, it amounts to telling them to shut down, even if it's temporarily, because those the radio station people knew that the chiefs were offended. Whether the chiefs really, really had a right to be offended or not is another matter. But they were offended. And they being subject and of that area and understanding how powerful Menshia is, felt that they had no choice but to apologize. It's kind of like sometimes children are told to apologize whether you did wrong or not. You know, if we went to the court of law would say the child had a right to point that out if the elder was misbehaving. Yet in our culture, children are not supposed to speak up, to criticize elders, right? So once Menshia had intimated that they shouldn't be on air, I think that the station felt obliged to comply. They felt intimidated, you know, to comply with it because they knew the ramifications. They probably saw what happened to Odike, so they were not about to risk their station being vandalized. And it is a problem. We've seen many instances where chiefs have incited violence against people. And we have to own up to these things happening within our society. Otherwise, you know, people's human rights will be trampled upon all of the time. If we want chieftaincy to be accommodated within the modern dispensation, then chieftaincy should know where the boundaries of their powers are and to do the responsible thing by going through the processes. I cannot say it enough. There are processes if you feel aggrieved. And chiefs are subject to those processes as well. You know, other institutions may be weak. But I want to respond to Professor Bakwa to say that the chieftaincy institution itself, even though it's been resilient, is also weak because some people have lost trust in their chiefs. Now, I don't know how many chiefs we have in this country. Many chiefs of different levels. So which chief has a right to banish people? Which chief has a right to do the kind of take the kind of action that Menshia did? If other smaller, in quotes, chiefs decide to do that, you can imagine how ungovernable Ghana would be. So there has to be a consensus, an understanding of the chieftaincy institution itself, that there are limits to their power and that they should consider going through certain processes if they feel offended. I cannot say it enough. We cannot get to a point where when people criticize chiefs, they are intimidated into shutting down. It's a dangerous precedent because it can be replicated throughout the country. We have chiefs throughout the country. It can be replicated. And pretty soon, the institution of chieftaincy will be unaccountable.
Interesting thoughts there. Let me come to Professor Agyemang-Duah. You've heard the reflections of Professor Akakpo on some of the statements that you, together with Mr. Safo Kantanka, have shared. But how do you react to what she says about, you know, the primordial interest, the chieftaincy institution and governance, the broader governance aspect? And then again, do you accept when Mr. Safo Kantanka says that Odike staged all of this? I mean, in our jurisdiction, legally, it is innocent until proven guilty. How do you react?
Mr. Kantanka's position at all. I cannot imagine Odike organizing guns and others to come and attack his office. I don't accept it. I think we need to have better investigation in the matter. And I do agree with Audrey that we got to be careful and have to determine the limits of powers of chiefs and all. But you see, determine the limits of power must be defined in the Constitution. The Constitution has a whole chapter on chieftaincy. And besides that, we have acts, Chieftaincy Act 1972, Chieftaincy Act, so on, so on, so. All these acts do not appear to align that institution with the democratic practice. You see, that's what the problem is. So if you are talking governance, chiefs in their own jurisdiction exercise traditional governance. And if you watch the whole tape of 1 hour, 35 minutes or so of the proceedings that occurred at the Kumasi Traditional Council, at least, if nothing at all, you'll be impressed by the processes that they went through in discussing the issue, where every chief had a right to express themselves before the final decision was made. So chiefs in their own jurisdiction do have these governance things. But I think what has been a challenge for us is to really to think carefully to see how we align. There are certain aspects of our cultural traditions that cannot stand today for obvious reasons. They are outmoded, no doubt. In the same way, there are some aspects that we can uphold because the values they give are good for our own existence. So we have to differentiate between those aspects that are outmoded and those that we can preserve. So when it comes to the current issue, look, I've taken time to review all the tapes. And as I think Mr. Kantanka said, it was an advice, but I also agree with Audrey that in view of the situation in Manchia, if you are advised to close your shop for a day or two before the final solution is reached, you better take the advice seriously out of intimidation or perhaps out of reverence for that traditional authority. So it can be either way. But I think what is important here is to further probe these issues and see how we can accommodate the chieftaincy. But the way we have structured our governance, no chief can be superior to the Constitution. All of us are under the Constitution of 1992. And I think anybody who goes beyond that is simply breaching our Constitution. At the same time also, when the Constitution says that the chiefs are the custodians of culture, tradition, and history, wherever, you cannot be a custodian without protecting what has been entrusted to you to keep. So you see that contradiction. So maybe chiefs act in certain ways because as custodians that the Constitution has bestowed upon them, they believe that they have to act to protect certain things, which may mean simply traditions, basically. And tradition requires that if you are going to achieve, for instance, either you go with a whiskey or a schnapp, or you go with certain things, or you don't speak directly to a chief, you have to go through a linguist, and all these are traditions that the chiefs seem to be keeping.
Right.
On one hand, it's not bad because, as I keep saying, our existence is rooted in these cultures and traditions and history. On the other hand, in our modern world, as Professor Gajipo rightly pointed out, there are certain things that cannot be done that we used to do. So in that respect, how the chiefs themselves, because as I said earlier, many of them are highly educated, and how those who are also educated, like those who are championing democracy, how we can bring our heads together to see how best we can find a way to get these two institutions aligned. Because you know what? Unfortunately, most Ghanaians live under two systems of governance, because those who are in the traditional areas, rural areas, have chiefs. Go and talk to them, how they revere their chiefs. At the same time, those of us who are highly educated, we don't seem to have much value for that institution. But those who value the institution outnumber those of us who think because of education, maybe we don't. So I think the proper thing to do is to find a way to accommodate the two sides. Because when I use the term resilience, I didn't mean that chiefs, the institution is not weak. No, they've suffered so many things in their existence, like you cited the Nkrumah thing of chase you without your sandals and all. And if you talk about corruption, they are, because they are Ghanaians. All Ghanaians, polls tell us that corruption is endemic. So if our political system is highly corrupt, we cannot expect that traditional institution not to be corrupt.
Right.
So we are all weak in that respect. So we need to find a way.
Shortly, we'll be winding down on the conversation in terms of the way forward. But I just want to put that pointed question to you, Prof. Is it high time we took a second look at our 1992 Constitution, especially in reference to the role of traditional authority in light of these happenings? Very quickly on that, if you may.
I will not hesitate at all. In fact, I'm one of those who are calling for constitutional review. And certainly the chieftaincy institution is one institution we have to examine critically and provide certain roles. In my humble view, like you are talking about going forward, the best we can do, I think, is to allow the chief certain roles in their own traditional areas. You see, when you compare monarchy in Ghana to Britain and other people, it's not the right comparison. Because in Ghana, we don't have it. We don't have monarchy. We have chiefs or kings in their own confined areas. Whereas Sweden, Netherlands, and all, they were kings or queens over the whole country. But here we don't. So if you're talking about powers of chieftaincy, chiefs and all, these are limited to their own traditional areas. So if you're looking for effective governance, for instance, recently, when the government found it very difficult to deal with the Galamsey, after bypassing the chiefs, now the minister came out to say, now we have to go to the chiefs to see how they help us to solve it. So in fact, if chiefs were to have a role, because, you know, most of their roles have been eroded through the decades by the state. So I agree. I will say that, sure, the chieftaincies, you have to be critically evaluated and see how best we can align it.
If we have Mr. Safo Kantanka back on the line with us, I would just have you wrap up briefly on the point you were making and then give us what you think is the way forward in this specific case, but generally as well, in terms of interactions between the state, traditional authority, and the media. Mr. Safo Kantanka. All right. We've not been able to reconnect with him. So I'll throw that to the two of you. I'll start with Professor Akakpo on that. How do we tie the loose ends? What's the way forward?
Well, is to please plead with the chief that they must recognize, even if the Constitution doesn't finally define it, they must recognize that whatever pronouncements they make must fit into the spirit as well as the letter of the Constitution. It's really important that they understand that, and so that they understand the limits of their power. And there are reasons why they must understand the limits of their power within modern governance structure. Therefore, chiefs should say, yes, people revere me, I am powerful. In some jurisdictions, you know, what the chief says, as Professor Bakwa rightly says, is even more powerful than what the politician says. But it doesn't mean that you need to abuse the human rights of the people within which, over whom you preside. And that's why the Constitution is important. Because I think the Constitution recognizes that even though there are chiefs, you know, those chiefs can also abuse the human rights of their subjects. You know, we can't assume that the chiefs are just so enlightened and so benevolent that sometimes they don't overstep their bounds, sometimes they don't abuse the constitutional rights of their subjects. They do, and there are many instances where they have that. And therefore, in these instances, the Constitution must remain the supreme guide of behavior. And the Constitution says there must be freedom of speech and expression. I understand that you must show deference to the chiefs and you must be polite. But when a subject does not do that, there are proper processes within modern society that you can go to. Did the chief even bother to contact the National Media Commission, for example? It's a state institution that could have been brought in to complain about the behavior of the radio station. And if the radio station continues to perpetrate that behavior, there are also other recourse that can be taken. But unilaterally telling radio stations, either not, in the case of Ada, you cannot come and cover the festival, or I advise you to shut down for a few days until I have determined the case against you. It's very, very problematic. Like I said, there are more than 500 radio stations in this country and TV stations. What if chiefs within certain jurisdictions that have been criticized and feel unfairly criticized decide to also issue similar edicts? What would happen?
Interesting perspectives shared there. Just hold for me as we wrap. Prof. Agyemang-Duah, your final thoughts?
I do agree with Professor Gadjekpo. I think until a review is done, it's important for all of us, including the chiefs, to respect the Constitution, especially on issues relating to the fundamental rights of citizens, because that's the bottom line of democracy, how we protect the rights of individuals. So if anybody seeks to undermine or deny any individual that liberty, that is a big no. So, and again, I should say, we know that certain practices of chiefs are not consistent with the new liberties and freedoms that we have. So in that respect, maybe democracy education may be something we have to consider for our institution of chieftaincy. They need to do that, even though, as I said, many of them are highly educated. Even amongst us who are not chiefs and highly educated, there are many of us who do not even understand these liberties and freedoms we're talking about. So it goes wrong. It goes wrong. All of us in this country, we need to have a heavy doses of democracy education so that the fundamental rights of citizens must be. So certainly I will not condone any act, unilateral acts of closing down radio stations or banishing people. Even though the context of these two incidents in Kumasi, I can have a certain sense of understanding, but not approval. So in that respect, I think it's very important that we bring our chieftaincy institution in conformity with the modern governance that we all cherish to have.
Gentlemen, lady, we're immensely grateful for your time. Osei-Bonsu Safo-Kantanka is a monarchical historian. He joined the conversation earlier. He made some interesting points there that for him, he feels Odike staged, masterminded that attack on his own party's office. That is an interesting twist. We also had Professor Agyemang-Duah, CEO of the Kufuor Foundation, who feels that definitely the 1992 Constitution must be tweaked in the sense of addressing that shift between traditional authority and political authority. We also had, joining the conversation, Professor Odike Gadjekpo, a communications person and an academic, who has also shared her thoughts on how wrong it is for traditional authority to overstep its bounds. Thank you so much for joining the conversation. All right. And so moving on from here, we have a lot more coming your way. We are also going to be talking about the KNUST situation and matters arising. And we're going to have a discussion shortly on climate change and why Africa is the focus in COP27 shortly to be held in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Do stay with us. We'll be right back.